Okay, thank you all for coming tonight. It's so good to have so many of you here. I'm going to play a quick video in a moment, but just quickly, can I have a show of hands who's been here before? Oh, it's more than I thought. And I did recognize a lot of you when you came in. And hands up who's never been here before. A few people, welcome. Thank you for coming. And who's been to one of our talks before? Hands up if you've been to one of our talks. 2, okay. Thank you for coming back to another one. And I hope tonight you guys get something from this. It should be really good. But for those who have never been before or who haven't actually seen this video we did a few years ago, or months ago even, this is a nice overview of what we're about and what we do here at GoPerform. So I'll just play that first. And we have no sound. Oh, it's giving me no audio, but I'll play the video anyway. It's a nice talk over from the directors here, Luke and Dan. Some of you might know Luke and Dan if you've been here before for treatment or for anything, or to some of our other talks. They've often spoken at those. But it's just a nice video that explains a little bit about what we do, the people we work with, how long we've been around and what we've been doing, and that's pretty much what it shows there. It's only about a minute long. But yeah, without the audio, it's slightly less exciting. If I remembered what they said, I would have said that over the top. Anyway, because there's no audio, I'm going to skip it. Okay, fine, we're ready. So, as I said, thank you all for coming. It's great to have you here. We're all really passionate about this topic in this area. Obviously, that's why we put this seminar on. We all work in this space, so we all work with youth athletes in some capacity. Myself and Robbie, we're youth strength conditioning coaches here. We work with a lot of youth athletes on a one-to-one basis. We work with youth athletes in groups that come and train with us. And we work with teams and clubs who kind of use our services for our expertise. And Sarah works regularly with young athletes who come in with injuries, so she treats them on that basis. And she works with some schools and sports teams as well on providing physiotherapy support as part of their scholarship or performance programs. So we're all really quite excited to be talking to you guys about this tonight. And the 3 talks that we're going to deliver, there is quite a lot of crossover between them, so they link quite a lot. So we'll try and make sure that it flows really well. If you have questions throughout any of the 3 talks, please do ask them as we go. But your question might be answered in a subsequent talk because I can't cover everything in mine, and neither can Robbie, and maybe the question you have about mine might be answered in Robbie's or Sarah's. So we will do a little Q&A at the very end. So if you think your question might be answered later on, just wait till the end and then we'll ask all of our questions then. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about growth and maturation first. I remember I've got a clicker. Okay, so understanding growth and maturation. Now, I'm starting with some definitions first. So growth must define as any measurable change in height or weight over time, and then maturation, that's the process of developing biological and sexual maturity. So 2 very separate things there, but very interrelated. Timing is when a particular biological process occurs. So if we're talking about growth again, it's the timing of when the growth spurt happens. Obviously, there are lots of other processes that happen throughout youth development, and they have different timings. Tempo or rate, that is the speed at which that process occurs. Chronological age, so this refers to how old a child is relative to their birthday, so how many years they've been on the planet. And then biological age is a slightly more recent thing where people are now looking at how old a child is relative to the average or how physiologically old they are. So you might have 2 children of exactly the same chronological age, but one kid is maybe 2 foot higher, has a beard, and the other is really short. So there are very big differences in biological age, irrespective of chronological age, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Now coming on to the growth spurt, a lot of what I'll talk about revolves quite heavily around this. It's one of the most important things to understand. It's technically termed peak height velocity, or PHV. I'll call it that for the rest of my presentation here. And it's defined as a rapid increase in growth, that's height and or weight, obviously both often occur at the same time. That's during adolescence, so that's what's called the adolescent growth spurt, or peak height velocity. Now we're going to have a quick walk through a graph that shows growth rate. So on this graph here, you've got age, that's chronological age, on the X, and then on the Y here, you've got growth rate, that's in centimeters per year. So when we talked about rate a second ago, or this is growth rate, it's the same thing. You've got two lines, you've got one for males, that's the solid one, and then the dotted one, that's for females. You can't really see much difference here because there actually isn't much difference between males and females up to about age 4. They both grow at about the same rate. As they then get a little bit older, so up to about age 8 here, obviously growth rate continues to decline. They're still growing, but obviously growth rate starts to come down a bit. You grow most quickly here up until about the age 8. And you can see still, there's not much difference really between males and females or boys and girls. They're actually growing at a similar rate, at about 5 to 6 centimeters of growth a year at about age 8. This graph is just an average, so it refers to like the average child. There are going to be massive fluctuations and differences between individuals, but this is only the average. And there's going to be another graph as well for brain development, social development, emotional development, and other things as well, but this is just looking at growth rate. When we get to about 10 or 12 years old, things start to change for females. For girls, obviously you can see there's a big acceleration there. It goes right up to about 8 to 9 centimeters a year of growth. This is what we call the peak height velocity, or the growth spurt. It's pretty obvious to see that big spike. And then you can see the boys' one is starting to accelerate as well, so I'll come on to the next slide. This is what we call the growth spurt, and it's really easy to see. Like, you know when someone goes through the growth spurt, it's obvious they get really tall really quickly, but that shows it quite clearly, I think. And what's really interesting is to see how different it is between males and females, or boys and girls. The start of peak height velocity is a little bit earlier. In girls, it generally starts at about age 12, but that can, starts a bit earlier, but the peak is at about age 12. It can vary quite a lot, so it could be between age 10 and 15 in girls. And in boys, the average age that they're at their peak is 14, but that can also vary quite a lot. So boys could start at about 9, but then their peak could be between ages 11 and 16. So there's huge variability there in the growth spurt or peak height velocity and how that differs between boys and girls. Okay, so what actually happens throughout childhood and adolescence? So I think if you saw on that previous slide there, I'd consider kind of childhood up to about 8, and then adolescence from about 8 to 18. So adolescence is accommodating or including, the growth spurt that we just saw. So what actually happens? So in childhood, like I said, there's not much difference between boys and girls. The changes that take place are quite similar. So the majority of the development that takes place is to do with the brain, to do with the neuromuscular system, and how your body coordinates itself and coordinates movements. So most of it is non-structural. It's difficult to, you don't see it, but they are changing a lot. When we get to about age 10, on average for girls, when peak height velocity starts, and up to about age 12, that's up to about age 12 for boys, but for girls it's earlier, and we have some different changes. So for girls, there are some big hormonal changes. There's a big release of estrogen, which promotes fat deposition around the hips and the thighs, and widening of the pelvis, and that can result in slightly altered biomechanics, alters the way that you move. And generally around peak height velocity or the growth spurt is when menstruation begins, and that can influence energy levels and fatigue, and also iron status and various other things that we need to be aware of. Now for the boys, their development starts a little bit later, so they, as we just saw, their growth spurt starts a year to 2 years later than it does with girls. As with girls do have an increase in testosterone as well, but boys have a much larger increase in testosterone. That's partly why they're stronger as they grow older. So that increase in testosterone increases muscle growth, bone density, and strength, and a broadening of the shoulders and other things that you can see. But that higher and larger increase in testosterone versus the girls means that they have a larger and a more prolonged peak height velocity or a longer growth spurt. So I think I'm not going to go back to the slide, but the spike on the boys' graph was a little bit higher, and it lasted a little bit longer than it did on the girls. And that's quite important, and Sarah will talk about something to do with that later and how that might expose boys to various injury risks that girls might not be exposed to. But I think actually the biggest thing that we notice is the biggest change between both boys and girls is that growth spurt. And because they are growing so rapidly during that period, it's really important to be aware that they're going to have a higher energy requirement. They're going to need more energy, they're going to need more food, because they need that to help them grow. So being really aware of maintaining a healthy and nutritious diet is important during that time. Okay, on to possible challenges. So obviously there are lots of challenges that come along with a rapid increase in growth. One thing that results in a challenge is growth in height before weight. So when people go through the growth spurt, they generally get much taller first before they almost grow outwards. So it's why boys will often look, or girls as well, will look quite lanky and tall before they fill out their frame and get a bit larger. And that increase in weight, or that increase in weight velocity, that can precede the height velocity or peak height velocity by about a year to about 1 to 2 months. So again, there's a bit of variation there. And bone growth as well. So bone growth is distal to proximal. So what I mean by that is the bones during growth spurt grow from far away from the body, so the kind of extremities almost, towards the body. So they grow from far away to close, if that makes sense. So what it does is it results in, again, boys looking lanky and tall and girls looking lanky and tall first. And both of these things, so this happens very quickly. So growth in height before weight and bone growth and everything else, it all happens very fast. So that's the peak height velocity, it's very fast. So that sudden change in body size results in something that we term adolescent awkwardness. Basically just means reduced coordination, reduced motor control. It's sometimes difficult to tell, and in some people you don't notice it at all, but in some young people it's really quite pronounced, and you can tell that they're struggling to coordinate things that would normally be really easy. They might struggle to learn things that typically they should learn really quickly. So being aware of that as a challenge during the growth spurt is really important, because some coaches and so on might not know that that's a thing, and they might not punish, but they might not give credit to the athlete because they feel like they're not learning as quickly as they should do. Okay, so how do we manage performance and learning? So how do you manage someone going through the growth spurt? So one thing I'm going to talk quite a bit on in a moment is taking regular measurements of height and weight to monitor their growth and maturation. This is really important. Reducing training load and competition load. So Sarah's going to talk about this in her presentation at the end. Prescribing appropriate training. So that's something Robbie will touch on, but that's about giving the young person the right training at the right stage of growth. So what you give a 16-year-old who's passed the growth spurt, well past it, you're not going to give to a 9-year-old who's barely developed and hasn't gone through the growth spurt yet. They're going to have very different physical abilities and training ages and so on, so you have to prescribe the right training to the right child. And then one thing at the end here, which I think is really quite important, is education. So given that you're all here tonight, that's brilliant. You're hopefully, I hope, learning something from it, and I hope you can go back and tell either your children, people you coach, people you work with, about some of these things that we're talking about tonight. So understanding more about the growth spurt and growth and maturation and how to manage a youth athlete is really important, so that you can tell a youth athlete why they're maybe not performing as well as they should be or as well as they're used to performing. So being aware of that and educating them is really important too. So on to measuring growth and maturation. Now, as I said, it's pretty obvious. You know when a child is going through the growth spurt, or you know they're growing, like they grow very, very quickly, and you can see that, it's visual. But measuring height and weight actually allows you to estimate how far away from the growth spurt they are before they get to it. So they are estimations, but it does give you a very good idea. It guides you as to when someone might go through that peak height velocity, so you can better prepare them for it. And understanding that and actually measuring it before it happens, it means you can tailor your coaching, tailor, I guess, your training and what the child is doing, so that they can then be better prepared for that period of change and challenge. And these are just some of the metrics that we'll look at in a moment. There's quite a lot of words there. I'm sorry, it's actually highlighted in green, but I didn't say it. So when you do measure growth and maturation, it's about being consistent and doing it regularly, but at least every 90 days. So every 3 months or quarterly. That's how often you'd want to get measures of height, sitting height, and weight. And in the initial period, a measurement of the parent's height as well. And I'll talk about that, or why you do that in a moment. So this is what we use to get these 3 measures. So for standing height, obviously you're standing, sitting height, you're sitting, and then we use scales for body weight, and then we measure parent height in the exact same way as this. And the key is to make sure heels are up against the back of this thing, this measuring thing, and the head and the back and the hips are all touching it as well. If you're measuring at home, you need to be up against a flat wall. So this is a perfect wall. Heels right up to the back, hips against the back, head and shoulders all tall, and then you measure obviously from the top of the skull down to the heels. That's how you do it at home. And same for sitting height. It's very easy for a kid to just sit and slouch in that position, but they have to sit upright with their shoulders back and their head high to get an accurate measure of sitting height. What that's measuring is almost their spine length. And then we subtract that from their total height to give an indication of leg length, so it can tell us how quickly their legs are growing and their spine is growing, just from two really, really easy to get measures. So they're not hard, they're really easy to get. And these are some of the metrics that we look at. So maturity offset, this is the years before or after the growth spurt. So ignore that bit in green, I was going to remove that, I realised it's way too complicated, I can't even understand it anymore. Maturity offset is the years before or after the growth spurt. So a positive number would be years after, a negative number would be years before the growth spurt. And there'll be an example of this in a moment. Age at peak height velocity, or APHV, that's just the age at which they'll reach the growth spurt. So they're two very related bits of information. Now, predicted adult height, this is a little bit more complex to calculate. There are some online calculators that you can use. They're really easy. You just have to input the information and click calculate, and it gives you a number. They're brilliant. But you need both parents' height, the child's standing height, and their weight. You don't need sitting height for this one. For the previous one, you just need sitting height and standing height and weight, no parent height. So very easy to do with a large group or a club without getting any parents involved. So predicted adult height is really good because it can predict potential in sports that require height. So there's an example I'll talk you through in a moment about two athletes who are the same height at the moment and the same age, but have one has a higher predicted height than the other. And we'll talk about that in a second. Something else you can do with it as well is you can help determine the level of physical maturity. So that graph is quite small at the bottom. It's the same one we looked at earlier. If you ignore the dotted line, within those red boxes there, if a child is up to 89% of their predicted adult height, they're pre-peak height velocity or before peak height velocity. If they're between 89 and 96% of predicted adult height, they're circa or during peak height velocity. If they're over 96% of their predicted adult height, then they're post-peak height velocity. And here's the example. So we have two athletes. Let's say they're both tennis players. They're both 13. They're both 150 centimeters tall. Athlete A is predicted to be 155 centimeters. Athlete B is predicted to be 170 centimeters. So athlete A is at 97% of their predicted adult height. Athlete B is at 88% of their predicted adult height. Which athlete do we think is likely performing better at the moment? Can I have a show of hands for A? And can I have a show of hands for B? And those who didn't put their hand up. Oh, that's all right. Okay, so most people said A, I think. And what about the second question here? So which athlete then is more likely to achieve long-term success? Who thinks A? If you have no idea, don't worry. Who thinks B? Good, okay, I think we're getting somewhere, that's good. All right, we'll come back to this in a moment, we'll discuss it. So when you're measuring growth and maturation, this is slightly similar, but it's a more simplified version of what we use here at GoPerform and with various schools and clubs and teams that we work with. I'll be sending out an email in a few days after the event, and I can send a copy of this so you can have a look and play around with it as well. But this is what we use. So you input your data here, you input gender, height, sitting height, weight, and everything, and then you get an output of a few of the variables that we were just talking about. So in the middle here, you've got age at peak height velocity, APHV, so I haven't got the actual age. Actual ages are like 13, 15, 11, and 13 again. And then age at peak height velocity is lower. That's interesting. It's fake data anyway, I just put my name, so the numbers might not work out. But anyway, it's the age at peak height velocity. So on the left, just past it on over here, you've got maturity offset. So again, that's similar in that it's the years before or after peak height velocity. So if it's a positive number, it's years post. If it's a negative number, it's years before. So obviously, me at the top here, I'm 2 months, or 0.2 years, I guess, actually, after my peak height velocity, but that means I'm still going through it. Whereas Sarah down here, she's 1.2 years before her peak height velocity, so 1.2 years is long enough. But well before it, she hasn't started her peak height velocity yet. Biological age, so like we spoke about earlier, that's the physiological or biological age of a child rather than their chronological age. This isn't an exact science, it's a calculation of the biological age using their age at peak height velocity and the average age where we'd expect them to go through peak height velocity minus their current age. But don't worry about how it's calculated, it's relatively accurate. And the age difference is then the difference between that and their actual age. Now, if we get more than 2 measures, so on the second and third measure, we can start to look at growth rate. So growth rate kind of corroborates and confirms what we already know from age at peak height velocity, maturity offset, and status. So it almost tells you the same thing. So we know here, if we're looking down at me again, on the second measure, I'm mid-peak height velocity. My growth rate is fast, because I think I put 4 centimeters in 3 months, which is quite a lot of growth. Whereas for Robbie, he's post-peak height velocity and his growth rate is slow. So they almost tell you the same thing. Obviously, growth rate, if it's fast, we know they're in peak height velocity. Anyway, so a lot of this data that we collect, we put into some dashboards that we can use to show parents and clubs or even the children themselves, to explain to them what their growth is kind of doing and how they're progressing. It helps inform our decision making, actually, so it is really quite good for us. It helps us make sure we're prescribing the appropriate training for those individuals. This is another example of something. So it's an output from one of our performance tests that we did with a club. And the grey bars show their total performance or their athleticism across a variety of tests that we deliver. And then the green shaded line at the top there, the dotted line, that's their percentage of predicted adult height. So having that extra bit of kind of growth information helps inform the coach and helps give the coach a little bit more context around their performance information. So they might be looking at some athletes saying, oh, they performed really, really well, but they're at a higher percentage of their predicted adult height. Whereas if someone performed really well, but is at a low percentage of their predicted adult height, they're outperforming the older people, if that makes sense. But it gives the coach a little bit more information. All right, back to our example here. So athlete A, athlete B, who's likely to be performing at a high level at the moment? We said A, I think, didn't we? And that's probably right. So the reason being is athlete A is at 97% of their predicted adult height. So they've gone through the growth spurt. They've gone through peak height velocity. So they've had that increase in testosterone. They've had that increase in strength and speed. So they're probably outperforming athlete B. We don't know. It's obviously hypothetical, but we'll assume that they are. So yes, they've already gone through peak height velocity. They're stronger and more powerful due to that testosterone increase. And then the second question, we were talking about which athlete is more likely to have long-term success. I think we all said B. I would say that's also correct. Again, it depends. It could be that athlete A is a really, really early maturer, and athlete B is just maturing on time. But either way, we can assume that athlete B is going to be more successful because they've got much more growth. But actually, what it could mean, if they're partners and they're playing together all the time in singles, if athlete A is currently better and they're beating athlete B all the time, athlete B might get really frustrated. They're like, oh, my partner's the same age as me, we're the same height, why am I not better? They might almost fall out of love with the sport because they're not aware that they're not as good because they haven't yet gone through peak height velocity. They haven't yet had those adaptations that athlete A has had. So that's where, as coaches and parents and teachers, it's good to be aware of that and measure it so that we can tell athlete B, you haven't gone through peak height velocity yet, you haven't had your growth spurt, give it time, wait, you'll catch up, you'll be at the same level as athlete A when you have those physical benefits that athlete A already has. So that's partly why being aware of this is really, really important. On the flip side, athlete B, if they're getting whooped by athlete A all the time, they have to learn to be way more technical and tactical and strategic with the way that they play because they can't rely on their physical dominance that maybe athlete A has somewhat. So by the time they catch them up in terms of height, they've learned all this technical and tactical skill that they can then apply with a greater physical output, which they get as they grow older. So in some athletes, if we can tell them to just wait, like you will grow into your body, you will get bigger, they can actually really harness that and get much better at their sport in other ways. Now, one final thing I just want to talk about, kind of related to what we just looked at. So we were looking at athlete A and B. Athlete A was an early maturer. Athlete B was a late maturer. This is really important to be aware of. So this graph is only really, well, it could be for boys or girls, it doesn't matter, but the dotted line is what we'd call an early maturer. The grey line is what we'd call a late maturer, and the black line in the middle there is normal or average growth rate. An early maturer basically just means they get bigger, they go through the growth spurt before the average, and then a late maturer means they go through the growth spurt later than the average or later than expected. And I think we'll all know from our school days, and kids, if you're here, you'll know from at school, you might have or might have had in your year some kids who were way bigger and stronger, who were maybe always selected for a sports team and maybe always did better than everyone else because they were just bigger naturally. That is always going to happen, and being aware of that is really important. And I did have a video of an example of some kids who are obviously early maturers. That last bit was horrible. This is the same. You notice it quite a lot in contact sports, obviously, where physical power, size, and strength are key to the sport. So they don't stand any chance against those kids, okay? Anyway, so to summarize, it's important to be aware of the growth spurt, when it occurs, and how it differs between children and how that can change. The growth spurt can affect coordination and learning, so the adolescent awkwardness we spoke about. Being aware of that is really, really important, and adjusting your expectations of the athlete or your child is important to give them time and space to grow into their body and develop as they are. The best way to understand growth is to monitor it regularly and consistently, and then adapt training and expectations again accordingly to where they are relative to the average, I suppose. And then, as we just saw there, the timing and tempo of growth is very variable. You can have some very early maturers and some very late maturers. Again, it's the same theme, being aware of early maturation, how that can be an advantage versus being a late maturer, and how that could initially be a disadvantage, but knowing that you need to give all athletes a chance to grow into their bodies and perform at the level that they can with their potential. Thank you. That is the end of my talk.